400 years of systematic hunting for the hat-making industry brought the beaver populations to the absolute brink of total extinction. Why are these small mammals suddenly being reintroduced into landscapes that have long been considered lifeless and beyond repair? It would seem that such a small creature could not impact a vast, cracked plain or a scorched riparian forest. But without the specific engineering of beaver dams, the water table remains deep underground, leaving the soil dry and the salmon populations completely vanished. Everything only gets more complicated further on. The camera glides along the dry riverbeds where not a single tree remains, and farmers are physically exhausted from constant legal battles over every last inch of available water. One can notice how the equipment remains idle in fields where the earth has literally split from dehydration. How can these genius ecosystem engineers bring these barren lands back to life using nothing but mud and fallen branches? But this is just the beginning. It is visible how the animals begin their work by instinct, slowing down the flow of any remaining moisture to rehydrate the surrounding soil. At first glance, the placement of a few sticks seems simple, but in reality, it initiates a complex hydrological chain reaction that restores the entire basin. The process is only gaining momentum as the water levels gradually rise, allowing native vegetation to sprout in areas that were previously nothing but dust. What must humans do to ensure that this rapid return of the species does not transform into a new environmental disaster? The transition to the next level of management involves precise monitoring of how the dams affect existing infrastructure and agricultural drainage. Success depends on maintaining a delicate balance between the natural expansion of the wetlands and the requirements of human land use. One can notice the water spreading in thin, even layers across the floodplains as the landscape begins to stabilize. The material for new growth is now present, and the river system moves toward a state of self-sustaining health without the need for human intervention. Thus, the ecosystem reaches a standard ready for the further stage of natural development. 70% of the riparian forests across the Pacific Northwest vanished as record-breaking heat waves and relentless droughts triggered a catastrophic ecosystem collapse. This thermal surge pushed summer water temperatures well beyond established survival thresholds for indigenous aquatic life. Why do rising temperatures cause such immediate devastation to river populations? The heat physically blocks the migration of adult salmon and simultaneously destroys their eggs before they can hatch, effectively ending the reproductive cycle. This localized crisis is only a small fragment of a much larger national trend. One can notice that the United States currently ranks among the nations with the fastest declining river systems on the entire planet. The Mississippi River serves as the primary artery for 40% of the nation's total landmass, yet its natural state has been systematically dismantled over centuries. Engineers have carved deep channels, constructed massive levees, and dammed the flow until the natural hydrologic rhythm was completely distorted. It seems simple to control a river for navigation, but in reality, these modifications lead to an annual environmental catastrophe in the Gulf of Mexico. Every summer, a massive dead zone forms as agricultural and industrial runoff flows downstream. Nitrate and phosphorus levels in these waters reach concentrations 3 to 5 times higher than safety limits. This chemical saturation creates a suffocating mass of low oxygen water that spans between several thousand and over 20,000 square kilometers. The camera glides along a surface where almost nothing can survive beneath the waves. The upper Mississippi alone has suffered the loss of nearly half of its historic floodplain forests since the 1800s. One of the richest biodiversity hotspots in North America has been erased by the steady expansion of industrial infrastructure. Washington state has entered a familiar and destructive death spiral. Forests burn and then vanish entirely, leaving the earth vulnerable to severe soil erosion. Mudslides follow the loss of vegetation, while the remaining water sources turn toxic from the high concentration of pollutants. Salmon populations die off as their habitat degrades, eventually leading to a point where the land itself begins to collapse under the strain. But this is just the beginning of the seasonal decline. During the dry season, up to 70% of the Yakima River's flow consists of recycled wastewater. This liquid is heavily loaded with nitrates, phosphates, and synthetic pesticides from surrounding industries. Under the intense heat of the summer sun, the river transforms into a boiling cauldron of toxic algae. It is visible how how the stagnant water thickens with organic bloom, creating an environment hostile to all complex life forms. The process concludes this phase, revealing a landscape where survival for even a single day becomes an impossible challenge. Thus, the transformation from a thriving ecosystem into a hazardous drainage system reaches its final stage. 40,000 beaver dams once functioned simultaneously across the Methow and Yakima valleys before the landscape began to dry out. Why did these natural structures succeed where modern engineering repeatedly fails? At first glance, the task of water management seems like a problem for heavy machinery and concrete, but in reality, the historical network operated around the clock at zero cost to the environment. The sheer scale of this biological infrastructure created a water distribution system so resilient that no contemporary project has been able to replicate its efficiency or its reach. The landscape is sinking deeper into despair, and humans have been forced to seek solutions more powerful than any previously attempted. Building a massive reservoir to capture disappearing water sounds promising, but the financial cost is staggering. One single basin requires an investment ranging from $500,000 to $2 million. This price includes carving open entire landscapes and permanently disrupting the ecosystems that depend on them. But this is just the beginning. Diverting water from major rivers represents the second proposed solution. It appears bold on paper, but it remains nearly impossible to execute in physical reality. One can notice how projects of this magnitude are halted instantly by layers of complex regulations. Every single meter of pipe must survive environmental reviews as grueling as an asylum application from the United States to Mexico. The process is only gaining momentum. When large-scale engineering falters, humans attempt to imitate nature by constructing artificial dams in regions like Utah and Oregon. Why do these man-made structures fail to stabilize the soil? A 2017 University of Idaho study revealed an uncomfortable truth regarding these installations. Just a few heavy rainstorms can knock these fragile wooden barriers apart completely. They demand constant, expensive repairs and still cannot replicate the complex ecological functions performed by living organisms. It only looks obvious that humans can build better than animals, but in reality, the artificial dams are mere shadows of the original. The equipment used to install them cannot match the millisecond precision of a biological builder. Everything only gets more complicated as the climate shifts. A bold idea emerged that sounded almost ridiculous at first. Farmers and ecologists alike agreed almost instantly to let the animals do the job they have perfected over millions of years. This shift occurred because people were confronted with historical data and forced to admit that nature had solved the irrigation problem far better than human technology ever did. The camera glides along the dry riverbeds where the solution once thrived. It gets more complex further on. To understand the real power of these structures, one must examine what they actually are. Each dam is not merely a wooden barrier placed across a stream by chance. It functions as a natural water storage station, slowing the current and trapping sediment while cooling the flow and expanding nutrient-rich wetlands. The equipment of the forest works silently to maintain the thermal balance of the water. This is not the limit of their utility. When the builders were hunted to near extinction, the entire network of biological pump stations vanished. Rivers dried out as if someone had unplugged a mechanical system, stopping the flow of life to the valley floor. One can notice how the greenery recedes when the water no longer lingers in the soil. But the history of these valleys shows that the animals were not always a rare sight in the territory. The material is ready to move to the next processing phase without haste. 400 million was the estimated population of beavers across the North American continent before the arrival of massive waves of European trappers. Why did such a vast biological network collapse so rapidly during the 16th century? Global markets were driven by an insatiable demand for pelts and castoreum, fuels for a burgeoning trade that prioritized material gain over ecological stability. This led to the emergence of the beaver fur hat, one of the most baffling fashion trends in human history, which accelerated the slaughter of these animals across every accessible waterway. The population plummeted to between 10 and 15 million individuals in just a few centuries. This represents a staggering decline of more than 95% from the original numbers. One can notice how the removal of a keystone species fundamentally altered the landscape, as the ecological fallout was entirely predictable once the biological engineers were gone. One mistake in land management triggered a cascade of increasingly severe consequences that echoed through the entire river system. Engineering was mistakenly believed to be a viable replacement for the complex natural processes of the wilderness. Technicians and planners began to straighten winding streams that had once meandered through valleys, pouring thousands of tons of concrete into riverbeds to create rigid channels. The equipment gradually forced water to flow as fast as possible toward the sea, stripping the land of its ability to retain moisture. In reality, this human intervention only exacerbated environmental instability. During the winter months, the lack of natural barriers produced devastating flash floods that swept away topsoil. By the summer, those same rivers turned into dry basins where life could no longer be sustained. The lesson provided by these failed infrastructure projects could not be clearer to modern ecologists. It only looks obvious that concrete and steel can control a river, but in reality, no human-built structure can compete with a system that beavers have been refining for millions of years. This realization shifted the focus from total control back to biological restoration. But this is just the beginning of the return of the ecosystem engineers. 2008 marked the start of one of the boldest and most effective ecological restoration projects in the United States. The Methow Beaver Project established a new protocol for managing the species in the state of Washington. Instead of killing nuisance beavers that interfered with suburban infrastructure or agricultural drainage, ecologists adopted an entirely different strategy based on relocation and coexistence. The process is only gaining momentum as these animals are moved back into the headwaters where their dams can function as intended. One can notice how the balance of the watershed begins to shift as the first sticks are placed in the current. $1,500,000 is the precise cost required to relocate a single pair of beavers, covering the entirety of their capture, medical monitoring, and logistical transport. Why do ecologists invest such significant resources into moving these animals instead of resorting to traditional removal methods? At first glance, the price tag for relocating 2 rodents might seem substantial, but in reality, this investment is 15 times cheaper than the expenses associated with engineering even a small-scale artificial dam that performs the same ecological functions. Ecologists in suburban regions have abandoned lethal control measures in favor of a sophisticated relocation cycle. The process begins with safe trapping and comprehensive health examinations for every individual. Specialists implant global positioning system chips for long-term tracking and assign unique identification names to the animals before they are loaded into specialized trucks. These vehicles transport the beavers toward the Methow and Yakima highlands, returning them to the exact landscapes their ancestors once inhabited. But this is just the beginning. Moving these mammals has never been a simple logistical task due to their extreme physiological sensitivity. It is visible how the team employs a strictly controlled, low-stress protocol to prevent the animals from injuring themselves during a panic response. Once the beavers are secured in humane traps, handlers immediately apply covers to block visual stimuli and reduce environmental anxiety. Within the transport compartments, the temperature is kept low, and the animals are provided with fresh water and branches to chew on during the journey. The process is only gaining momentum as the trucks reach the high-altitude release sites. One can notice how the teams manually carry each heavy crate down to the very edge of the stream. They do not force the animals out, but instead open the gates slowly, allowing each beaver to step into the water on its own terms. Everything only gets more complicated once the animals are in the wild, as their survival depends on their ability to adapt to new territories. Over 300 beavers were reintroduced across more than 60 different sites within the Methow Basin alone by the year 2020. Despite the species being known for its aggressive territorial behavior, the project achieved a successful adaptation rate of up to 70%. Scientists originally held the modest hope that the beavers would simply remain in place and perhaps construct a few small structures. No one expected the animals to resurrect an entire desertified landscape through their natural instincts. Beavers do not build dams for the sake of activity, but as a fundamental mechanism for their own survival. By engineering these structures to raise local water levels, they create deep aquatic barriers that shield them from predators such as coyotes and lynx. A quiet, stable pond also serves as a protected nursery where they can safely raise their kits during their most vulnerable early months. It gets more complex further on as the water begins to saturate the surrounding environment. One can notice how the water spreads across the parched soil, allowing roots to regain moisture and native grasses to return to the valley floors. The first dams typically appear within just 36 weeks of the initial release. These are modest structures standing only 60 to 90 centimeters tall, appearing rough and unassuming to the casual observer. But the true power of a beaver dam has nothing to do with its physical dimensions. It lies in its ability to store and distribute water across an entire ecosystem.